Let's see. Where were we? Right. Part 2 of the Halloween special of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. And I thought since this is a Halloween special, we could start with something scary. Like wolves. At last count, there are just over 100 Mexican gray wolves in Arizona. These wolves are some of the most rare and endangered species in North America. These predators are essential to a healthy wildlife habitat. Predators whose natural instinct is to hunt animals they see as prey. Soft, gentle creatures like deer, rabbits, and mice. These wolves roam free around the grasslands and rolling hills in the more remote areas of Arizona. And not too far from where those wolves roam is a quiet refuge, a den for humans. A place where humans go to gather, to tend to themselves. A safe space, a special place, a treatment center to heal, to become healthy again. Their own mental health endangered by the brutality and cruelty of the outside world. They are here for protection, for rehabilitation. What they don't know is that walking among them is a different kind of predator. Not a wolf, but a vampire. A woman known as a trauma vampire who thrived off of the pain and misery and sickness of others, taking their darkest memories, their deepest secrets, and spinning them into stories of her own. And now this vampire will be among them. And the question is, who will be her next victim? You'll find out in this episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, the second half, the final chapter, about Vampire Girl. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator, writer, producer, and host of Dead Sleep. Dead Sleep is a niche true crime podcast made for people like me, people who like to fall asleep to true crime and want good stories that aren't too loud. There are no obnoxious ads in Dead Sleep. Not too violent. There are never graphic depictions of violence in this show. Suspenseful, yet soothing, to help you fall asleep. Dead Sleep, as you know, is listener supported. And I plan to keep it that way. Help me do that by becoming a paid subscriber via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Tonight's episode, just like the previous episode, was drawn from an article in Vanity Fair, first reported by an extraordinary journalist who always gets the stories first. Her name is Evgenia Perez, and she and her production partner turned this into a documentary called Anatomy of Lies. I will link to those key sources in the show notes, along with some other Dead Sleep details that I put together with this episode to help make this story a brain puzzle. And tonight's episode is like the Jenga of a brain puzzle, of a woman stacking lie upon lie upon lie. You have to wonder, how long can she keep going before it all topples down? Just a heads up for listeners, much of this story takes place in an addiction and recovery center, so we will be covering those topics: trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the circumstances around those disorders. I write this in a way that I'm comfortable with, but that is a matter of personal preference. So please take care while listening. So let's settle in for the night. Get cozy under those covers. Close your eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime in the conclusion of the saga of Vampire Girl. No matter where you go, where you end up, or what's happened to you, there's one golden rule in recovery. Never compare yourself to someone else. Your problems are your problems. Your recovery is your recovery. Your needs are yours. And your story is your own. You're not in competition with anyone else. And there's no hierarchy of people who are more screwed up than someone else. You just do you, one day at a time. That said, the inpatient residents at an addiction and recovery center called Sierra Tucson, located about 30 minutes away from Tucson, Arizona. The people there recognized that there was one person at Sierra Tucson who was the sickest of them all. No one said it aloud, but it was tacitly understood that the woman who appeared to be in the worst shape was a woman named Jen. This was in the spring of 2019, and Jen had been there for a few months. And she was a tough case. They didn't know a lot about her because she barely spoke. And when she did speak, her voice was just barely a whisper. She had, obviously, some severe PTSD. But the nature of her trauma and what had happened, the full scope of that wasn't clear. What was clear was she was terrified. All of the time. PTSD. It's become a common enough shorthand for enduring trauma that we kind of forgot what the origin of PTSD was. It was a condition that came into the American consciousness after the Vietnam War. And post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, entered the DSM-3, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in 1980. But examples of PTSD can be found going back centuries. And here in the United States, Our research with PTSD started as far back as the Civil War. Over time, of course, we've come to realize that even people who haven't seen battle can experience PTSD. And for years, it was believed that it was one experience, one shocking event, one big thing was the cause of PTSD. Researchers have begun to understand that you can feel a sense of trauma after an incident that can be a car accident or a robbery, things that seem specific and relatively small compared to the horrors of war. But to that individual, that stress was debilitating. Treatment for PTSD, despite our best efforts, isn't perfect. There is no cure. And people keep trying. Healthcare professionals have all types of modalities as a way to try and treat and ease the symptoms, at least, of PTSD, with the hope that you can heal. And this recovery center, this mental health facility, Sierra Tucson, was considered to be on the forefront of some of these treatments. And for Jen, it was more than a treatment. It was her only hope. Jen didn't like to talk about what happened. She was still trying to make sense of it herself. But her behavior suggested fear, like someone who was hiding in a foxhole, afraid of every sound, alert to every twig snap. A door slamming could feel like a bomb going off. Jen wasn't old. She was maybe in her late 30s, early 40s. But she had the look of a woman who'd had a hard life. Jen was pale, with a weak smile and the hollow, haunted look of one of those women in those old vintage photos. Those black and white portraits from the Dust Bowl. Those Dorothy Lang images of an exhausted woman with an apron on, a kid on each hip, and a weariness in her eyes. The face of a woman asking, "Why me? What next?" Jen had a hippie, earthy vibe. Natural, with long, curly brown hair. And in her hair was a single streak of gray. A silver white that looked like a bolt of lightning. Like something had happened to her that was so terrifying. It turned her hair white forever. And it was fair to say she'd endured a shocking event. It was the thing that landed her here, in this dressed-up mental hospital, by court order, with some serious stakes. Back in 2018, life seemed normal, whatever that meant. Jen was an RN, a registered nurse, back in Topeka, Kansas. She was married with 5 children. Her husband, Brandon, was a local activist. On the outside, they seemed like the perfect family. But the reality was, Jen was in a very bad, very abusive marriage. At rallies, her activist husband exuded a fiery energy that made him seem like a hero, fighting for the little guy, a noble cause. In truth, he was a cowardly abuser who went after easy targets, like his wife. Brandon, her husband, had a way of getting into her head. He was so manipulative It was like he could crawl inside her mind, as if there was some unlocked door he knew how to sneak through. And once inside her head, he'd stay there. He wouldn't leave. Even when he wasn't around, she could hear his voice, his control, no matter where she went. Jen developed a coping mechanism, a way to escape. She'd pretend to be somewhere else, anywhere else, but with her husband and in that situation. And for a while, it worked. But that coping mechanism of putting your mind elsewhere had an unexpected and terrifying side effect. One day, driving down a busy road in her hometown of Topeka, Jen remembered having her children in the back seat, and then something came over her. She doesn't know what it was, but she blacked out in a dissociative fugue state. And when she snapped out of it, of this weird trance-like state, she found herself on the side of the busy road, her car pulled over, doors open, but she was alone. Her 2 young children who were strapped in the back seat, they were gone. Jen, of course, was in a panic. She phoned the police, and within minutes, the children were found nearby. It was hard for her to explain to authorities what happened. They were reunited, and it seemed like the incident was over. The next day, however, she was called into the Office of Child Protective Service. She recounted what had happened. She told the truth. Maybe she needed help. But instead of giving her help, CPS told her they were charging her with child abandonment and taking her kids away. She and her husband, Brendan, were going through a divorce. Brendan took this opportunity to let everyone know. Jen was psychotic, that she was dangerous to her kids and herself, and she needed to be sent away. Now, there are many more bits and pieces to the story, but the bottom line was she was sent to Sierra Tucson, this facility, where she had to get better. If she didn't get better, she wouldn't get her kids back. So there she was, shell-shocked, trying to figure out what was wrong with her. The inciting incident on the surface was that car thing, that weird fugue thing that happened. But really, her trauma was the abuse of her husband. And that was going to take Jen some time to figure out and piece together. So she was there to do that, so she could get her kids back, go home, and be a mom again. Who knew how long that was going to take? It seemed impossible. The event with her children happened 2 days after Christmas, 2018. By that following spring, Jen was still there, still struggling to make progress. Then she met someone, a woman who would change her life forever. She introduced herself to Jen as Jo. Pretty much from the first few days that Jo was at this facility, she sought out Jen's attention, wanted her company. one day when Jen was on a walk around the grounds of the facility, Joe appeared, and she said, "Hi, you don't have to talk to me, but if you do want to talk, I'm here." And thus began a friendship that over the next few weeks grew close. Jen and Joe became roommates. Jen and Joe, they shared a similar trauma. It was uncanny, actually, because Joe had initially come to this facility because of a shooting at a synagogue, one that took place on October 27th, 2018. Joe's PTSD was around the shooting, what happened that day, on that Sunday, when 11 people were killed during those Sunday services at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. Joe said she could still hear the echoes of the screams and the gunshots. It was all something she couldn't seem to let go of. Like Jen, Joe also appeared to be extremely sensitive to sound. You couldn't scrape a chair. You couldn't even walk behind her without Joe seizing up in terror. Then as time went on, and as people shared more about themselves, Joe revealed to Jen one day that she had this revelation that the synagogue, that whole PTSD trauma, it wasn't really about the shooting at the synagogue. The PTSD around the synagogue was just a symptom, masking a deeper trauma, one that she discovered while here in therapy at this facility. That she, Joe, had been abused by her older brother, Eric. And she basically blocked out that abuse. But now here at this place, it was like these two women realized they had almost the same exact type of trauma. Now that the two had built up a relationship, and Jen actually trusted Joe, which wasn't easy, she was forthcoming about her life. Jen told Joe about her abusive husband. She told her about her 5 kids. She explained what happened and how she felt like she'd gone crazy, how her kids were taken away, and how this stay at this facility was one crucial step in getting her kids back. That's why she was here, and it's the only thing she cared about. Joe became invested in Jen's recovery. They were roommates, and they were together all the time. Joe asked Jen a million questions about her life. Some worried that Joe was so caring, so altruistic, that she was putting Jen's needs before her own. This was recovery, therapy, remember? You're there to work on yourself. But Joe was the only one who brought Jen out of her shell. In videos from that time, Joe can be seen with Jen running around, hiking, her dark hair shiny, her cheeks flush with life. And during Joe's stay at this place, sometimes she'd have to leave for a few days to go and work. This was highly unusual when you were at Sierra Tucson. Joe didn't say what she did for a living, and she made it clear that she didn't want to talk about it. But then she'd come back, and she and Jen would pick up where they left off. They were best friends, basically. Joe made a point of telling Jen, "I love you, and I always will." Jen needed a friend. She needed to hear that she was loved. It'd been a really long time. Jen's PTSD was severe enough that she was willing to try anything to get better. And that included a type of therapy, a light therapy called EMDR. EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing Therapy. And EMDR works like how it sounds. Through eye movement, along with other stimuli, patients who suffer from trauma can essentially rearrange their neural networks, remove the blockages of that traumatic memory. And once that blockage is cleared, the mind can heal. Now, this is my layperson understanding of how EMDR works, but the bottom line for someone like Jen was that EMDR offered a possible solution to her PTSD that was faster than a lot of talk therapy. Now, Joe, she wasn't doing EMDR for whatever reason. And Jen would later remember Joe asking all about it, how it worked, what it was like. Ultimately, EMDR didn't help Jen. But as time went on, she was rebuilding herself. She was getting stronger mentally and more confident. And part of that was thanks to Joe's friendship. One day, Joe's parents came to visit. And Jen was really excited to meet Joe's parents. This wonderful woman must have wonderful parents. But the reason why Joe's parents were there, it was an unpleasant and shocking conversation. Because Joe had invited her parents to visit her at this facility in Tucson, from where they lived in New Jersey, to explain to them something they didn't know. That their son, her older brother Eric, had abused her. It was like a repressed memory, the events being so traumatic that her conscious mind had buried them. Joe's parents couldn't believe it. According to Jen, they were like deer in the headlights. Why hadn't they heard of this before? What was going on? And they felt terribly for their daughter. Not only did she have this horrible PTSD, there was a synagogue shooting, and then, of course, there was her cancer. Jen looked at her friend Joe and wondered, cancer? What cancer? Once her parents left, Joe said she could explain everything. Her real name was Elizabeth Finch. Joe was a character on a TV show called Grey's Anatomy. And Elizabeth Finch, Finchy, was a writer on that show. But she went under the name Joe because she was, a famous Hollywood writer, and she didn't want anyone to find out that she was here. She'd even told her parents, before they arrived, to call her Joe, so that they wouldn't give her real identity away. And she confessed, yes, she did have cancer. but she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want this cancer to define her. As her friend and as a nurse, Jen respected that, and she didn't push the issue further. Of course, you and I know from the previous episode that back in Los Angeles on the staff of Grey's Anatomy, Finch was always talking about her cancer, writing about her cancer online and in articles, making viral videos about her cancer, and incorporating her cancer treatment into plot lines on Grey's Anatomy. Cancer was kind of her brand. At one point, she did reveal to Jen that she'd had some pretty heavy rounds of chemo. The chemo port, the whole thing. And all of those toxins from the chemo messed with her kidneys. And she had to have one removed, and now she only had one kidney. Now again, you and I remember from the previous episode that it was always rumored, it's hard for me to say this without laughing, it was always rumored that the rumor was, back in LA, that she had a kidney transplant, and the donor of her kidney was none other than the award-winning film and TV star Anna Paquin, with whom Finch was very good friends because of Finch working on Paquin's series, True Blood. And if you'd asked anyone at Grey's Anatomy, they'd remember receiving text messages from a friend of Finch's on Finch's phone from the hospital as she was getting that kidney transplant operation. But here, as Jo, she was a one-kidney wonder. And there were some other key details that had shifted when she changed her identity from Finch to Jo. Specifically, with what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Here at the facility with Jen, she told everyone that she was there the day of the shooting. That's October 27th, 2018. And gave the impression that she herself was a survivor of the shooting. You'll remember in the LA version of events, it was that she had a good friend who was there on that Sunday. And Finch had flown out that night to get there in the morning so she could help clean up her friend's remains on site. And now there was this unburied trauma about the abuse by her brother. And she told her parents and friends all about it. For what it's worth, apparently she'd never confronted Eric himself. We can't know because he's never actually spoken on the record, nor have Finch's parents. Looking back, the details are eerily similar to her best friend, Jen. Just as Jen was getting back on her feet, something terrifying happened. Her husband, Brandon, sent her scary videos, suggesting that he was going to come and find her, that he was going to come and get her. And coincidentally, around that same time, Jo received a letter from her brother, handwritten, that said he was going to come and get her. He was threatening her. The timing was incredible. almost unbelievable. But Jen didn't think anything of it at the time. Why would she? Her number one goal was to get well and get her family back. She was there to support her friend Joe, whatever she was going through. And it just so happened that they were experiencing very similar things. There was one thing, however, that Joe didn't confess. Something that Jen wouldn't find out until much, much later. That Joe, Finch, was a vampire. A trauma vampire. And all throughout her stay at this facility, she was stealing Jen's life and funneling Jen's life into a character on Grey's Anatomy, using her pain and her recovery as material for the hit series. Everything that Jen was going through, the abusive and violent husband, the dissociative disorder, the PTSD, even the therapy, the EMDR, would eventually make it onto the TV screen. Jen's life, absorbed by Finch and put into the character, the Grey's Anatomy character, Joe. Jen was completely oblivious that this was happening. And she didn't have time to think about Grey's Anatomy or any other show. She had worked hard on getting better. And in the early summer of 2019, Jen returned back to Topeka, Kansas, eager to rebuild her life. Meanwhile, Joe went back to being Finch, back to her life in Hollywood. But she stayed in touch with Jen. And she wrote her and texted her and connected with her and left her messages a lot. They lived in two different worlds. There was Finch's glamorous life there in Hollywood, and there was Jen, who was living in a women's shelter, as she and her husband were in the midst of a divorce. And her husband, Brendan, when she returned, he began threatening her. And she feared for her life so much that she had to go into a safe house, basically a single bed by herself, where nobody could find her and no one could know where she was. So her husband wouldn't find out and try and hurt her. Her husband somehow tracked her down. And he didn't break in, but he took a photograph of a place across the street and sent it to her so that she could see that he knew where she was at all times. Jen felt entirely alone. Finch was her lifeline. Finch had an idea. With everything going on there, why didn't she take a beat? Come out to California. Finch needed a vacation too. They'd go up the coast to Ojai and just relax. It was Finch's treat. Jen and Finch were close. But during that stay in Ojai, as they walked among the orange groves, they grew even closer. When Jen told Finch that she really liked her. Liked her. And Finch told Jen she felt the same way. And they kissed. And the two women decided to be in a relationship together. They were in love. It would take some time, but they would find a way to make it work. They wouldn't have that time. In September of 2019, while Jen was on a quick trip to visit Finch, she learned some shocking news. Brandon, her husband, had taken his own life. Jen had to return back to Topeka right now, and Finch said she'd go with her and lend her support. Jen was going to be allowed to see her children for the first time in nearly a year. They were all going to spend a few days together so they could grieve. Jen and Finch were in love. And while this wasn't the best time, Jen decided to reveal to her children that she and Finch were in a relationship. The kids were shocked, but overall, they were happy. They wanted their mom to be happy. And they quickly grew to love Finch. And so did all of Jen's friends. Finch was generous and funny and kind, and she was practically a celebrity, a Hollywood writer on a hit TV show. Jen's life was finally falling into place. Just before Thanksgiving, in November of 2019, Jen got her kids back. And soon after that, the final piece of the puzzle. Finch proposed to Jen. Did she want to get married? Jen said yes. There was the romantic side to all of this. They were in love. But then there was the practical side. After losing her kids to foster care, Jen was worried. If anything ever happened to her, she would never want her kids to be separated and put into the system ever again. Thanks to Finch, she wouldn't have to. The kids loved Finch. She was like a second mother. And Jen knew Finch loved those children like her own. Back at Grey's Anatomy, her colleagues were surprised. Finch never liked kids. And moving to Topeka, getting married to a woman she met at a mental health facility, it seemed rash. Then again, with all they knew about Finch's cancer, maybe she didn't have much time left. And this family offered her the love and stability she needed in what might be her final years. And how could they forget the terrible tragedy that happened with her brother? And this is where Finch's life becomes itself like a cancer. Her lies divide and spread and metastasize, latching onto other people and threatening to destroy their innocent lives. Earlier in September, when Jen learned that her husband, Brandon, had killed himself, and Finch had rushed to be with her, Finch shared a different version of events with her Grey's Anatomy colleagues. She sent an email to everyone saying, "Sorry for the short notice." But her brother Eric had attempted to take his own life. Eric was a doctor, and everyone thought he lived in Florida. But apparently, Finch had to go to Topeka, Kansas, where her brother was in a coma on life support. And it was Finch who was tasked with pulling the plug. And I want to take a moment to read from the email that Finch sent to her Grey's Anatomy colleagues, because I think it'll really help capture the tone of all of this. The low-key audacity of this deception. All right, here it is. Hey all, I've been absent and coming back tomorrow. I don't know who's been looped into what, and I'd rather put it out there so no one is in the dark or feeling eggshelly. I've gone because my brother died by suicide. He was on life support for a short while, but ultimately did not survive. I say this not because I need or want anything from anyone. I'm not a delicate flower or whatever. I just want people to know I'm still here, still part of the team. I intended just to power through my episode shoot, but I recognized I needed just to take a bit more time away to process. Missed y'all. Finchy. This processing time would include a trip to Hawaii with Jen. Meanwhile, back at Grey's Anatomy, she told the team that she had to go to Hawaii so she could meet the illegitimate child of her abusive and now deceased brother, Eric. The stories were becoming so outrageous that it was almost like she wanted to get caught. But people at Grey's Anatomy, they had become accustomed, conditioned to bad and strange and impossible things happening to Finch. It was the art of the long con. They felt bad for her. Back in Topeka, however, Jen was picking up on a few things and noticed one red flag. It was Christmas time, December 2019. Jen's teenage son was an accomplished ballet dancer, and this year he'd earned the part, a huge starring role as a lead dancer in The Nutcracker. Now, Christmas time was sensitive for this family. A year earlier, back in 2018, Jen had lost her kids just a few days after Christmas. So this was a huge celebration and a milestone for this family. Jen threw a huge party for her son. Everyone was there. Finch was there too. And just as the party was in full swing, Jen noticed Finch appeared ill. She asked her what was wrong, and Finch revealed, wincing in quiet pain, that it was her kidney, her one good kidney. She thinks she had a kidney stone, and with one kidney, it could be serious. She didn't want to cause any trouble, but Finch was just going to go to the ER by herself. Jen, of course, wasn't going to let that happen. And despite Finch's heated protests, Jen muscled her way into the hospital room so she could be there with her future wife. Because Finch had one kidney, the doctor didn't want to take any chances. So he suggested that they put her through something called the donut of truth. The donut of truth was actually a scanning machine, like a CT scan, that would tell them what was up with her one good kidney. When the test results came back, Jen noticed the doctor acting strangely. And as she and Finch sat there, she felt like the doctor was looking straight at her, not Finch. And he said to Jen, almost like a warning, her kidneys are fine. As Jen and Finch left, Jen remarked on that. He said kidneys. Plural, right? Finch blew it off. He'd made a mistake. He didn't know what he was talking about. And Jen just let it go. She wanted to go back and celebrate with her son and move forward with her life. The couple were married in February of 2020. They had some big plans, including moving everyone, Jen and the 5 children, to California, to LA, full time. Then something started to shift. Part of this was the pandemic. Instead of flying back and forth from LA to Topeka, as Finch had planned, Finch was in Topeka full time with Jen and the children. And the stress was starting to build. Much of the initial stress was about Finch's health. Her immune system was compromised because of her cancer. Therefore, the children, they had to be very careful about exposure to COVID because it might kill Finch. And it seemed that once again, Finch had created an environment that she controlled essentially with her illness. And everyone in the house, they were focused on putting Finch first and keeping her safe. This included Finch's triggers. There was the old standby, her trigger because of the synagogue shooting that made her afraid of gunfire, any kind of gunfire. So if the kids were watching TV and a gun went off on a show, they had to turn it down or turn it off. Then a new trigger emerged. One day, Finch announced that rainy days were a trigger. Jen wondered, since when? And she said, not entirely nicely, you never had any trouble with rainy days before. But well, now Finch did. And so when it rained, these rainy days, it reminded her of the shooting at the synagogue. And now these rainy day triggers, whenever it rained, she would basically stay in bed all day. Jen noticed that she rarely engaged with her children anymore. Didn't lift a finger around the house. Jen thought she was getting a partner. Instead, she felt like she had one more child to take care of. She never felt so alone. Strangely, over in the world of Grey's Anatomy, Finch told her colleagues she needed some time off she had to push deadlines because, as she explained, her wife, she wasn't doing very well. She was unstable mentally, and it fell on Finch to take care of these 5 kids. Over in Grey's Anatomy land, they worried about Finch, how she might have made a mistake getting involved with this woman who seemed like maybe she had conned Finch into marrying her for her money. Finch seemed like she was in a bad place, and they wanted her to know that they were there for her if she needed them. Jen had no idea that Finch was saying this about her, or that Finch was giving Grey's Anatomy the perception that she was the prime caretaker and asserting that she, Jen, was unstable. Jen kept circling back to that new rainy day trigger. And she remembered the date of the synagogue shooting, October 27th, 2018. She scrolled down Finch's Facebook page. Down and down. Post after post after post. Until she landed on October 27th, 2018. And there Finch was. Not in a synagogue, but at a Halloween party. That year, she was dressed as Wednesday Addams. And there was her photo with a friend next to her, as clear as day. Right there. And there were more photos from that subsequent day, the day that she was supposedly cleaning up the remains of her best friend. And again, she was not in Pittsburgh. These photos were in Los Angeles. It was pretty clear, to Jen at least, that this whole synagogue thing, it was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else about Finch was untrue? She felt sick as she pushed down further into Finch's Facebook history, digging all the way back to 2012, around the time of Finch's earliest cancer treatments. And there was a picture of Finch, gaunt, seemingly bald, a scarf wrapped around her head, and a bandage over her chemo port, that little incision in her chest where the catheter typically goes. How she'd said she'd had all that chemo, so much chemo that it destroyed one of her kidneys. A chemo port leaves a little scar. Jen was a nurse, and she could see the bandage on Finch's chest wasn't done by any medical professional. And she knew from being intimate with Finch that she didn't have a scar from that chemo port. Everything was a lie. And that's when the reality of Jen's situation sank in. Oh my God. I met a woman at a mental hospital, and not only did she become my best friend, I married her. Jen didn't know who was crazier. The woman who pretended to have cancer and feigned PTSD from a synagogue shooting she wasn't at? or the woman who fell in love with that woman, brought her home, introduced her to her kids, and became her partner for life. Most of us would imagine ourselves running screaming into the night, maybe packing up all of Finch's things and kicking her out of the house and never speaking to her again. But Jen's take was this. Finch needed help. And when Jen was in trouble, when Jen was at her lowest, Finch was there for her. Maybe if Jen connected with Finch, she could guide her into getting better. She still loved her, at least the person she knew Finch to be. That she had a problem with these lies, but if she was willing to tell the truth, they had a future together. And at first, it seemed that Finch was willing to come clean. And it took time, but eventually Finch did tell Jen the truth. That she'd never had cancer, that she'd never been to the synagogue, that she had both healthy kidneys, though she still doubled down on her brother abusing her. And there's much more to what happened between the two women. But the bottom line was, there was a point over the next few months that she thought maybe it could work. But Finch was defiant. She was not going to risk her career or her ego in revealing all of her lies to the people at Grey's Anatomy. No way. And this was when things turned from a woman who had emotional problems and played sick to get attention into a dark, disturbing person who used money and power to destroy the life of another person. Because Finch, this trauma vampire, had already stolen Jen's story. And now she was going to consume the rest of her life. Finch hired an expensive and high-powered attorney and taunted Jen that Finch was going to sue for custody of those 5 kids. Finch was trying to break Jen, and she knew exactly how to do it. And the sad thing is, it almost worked. It felt completely hopeless, and she began to believe that her kids and the rest of the world would be better without her. And then, somewhere along the way, Jen dug deep and decided to fight back. And everybody knows the one way to kill a vampire was by driving a stake through its heart. So that's what Jen did. She drove a stake through the one thing that Finch loved more than anything or anyone else: her career. She managed to track down Shonda Rhimes' email address, and she wrote a letter to Shonda Rhimes asking for her to stop letting Finch tell other people's stories, passing them off as her own. These were survivor stories, she said, and they didn't belong to Finch. Ultimately, it was that email and some other communication that Jen did that led to Disney HR looking into Finch's whole story and uncovering the truth. And how elaborate and complicated it all was. Finch was forced to come clean. That she'd never had cancer, that she'd never had a kidney transplant, that she was not at the Tree of Life shooting, that her brother Eric was alive and in Florida. And that all those times she said that she was sick, she wasn't. Since this was all exposed, and again, there's so much more to this story, as always, check out the links in the show notes. But since this all came to light, a lot of people have tried to figure out what exactly was wrong with Finch. And we could spend a lot of time wondering. But something that one of her Grey's Anatomy co-writers pointed out that I thought was really smart, that searching for the why would give Finch what she wanted, which would be at the center of the story, at the center of our thinking, that she doesn't deserve to be a main character when she's really just an extra. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back in November with an all-new bonus episode for subscribers. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, nighty-night.